December 12, 1978, downtown Medellín. 8:14 p.m., hubris. If you could bottle the smell of the room on the second floor of the Club Campestre that night, it wouldn't smell like imported whiskey or Cuban tobacco, though both were present in excessive quantities. It would smell like hubris. It is a thick, cloying scent, sweet and rotting, the kind of atmosphere that only exists when men believe they have conquered God. 3 men sat around a table made of polished mahogany, the wood dark and ancient, gleaming under the low amber light of the chandeliers. To the casual observer, this was just a business meeting among successful exporters. But the devil is always in the details. Look closer at the table. It wasn't covered in ledgers or contracts. It was covered in stacks of cash, dirty, humid bills that had traveled all the way from the streets of South Florida, passed through sweaty hands, stuffed into duffel bags, and flown over the Caribbean to rest here, in the cool mountain air of the Andes. The man at the head of the table was known simply as the accountant. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hitman. He was a man of numbers, a mid-level boss who managed the logistics of the Medellín cartel's routes. He was the type of man who confused proximity to power with power itself. On this night, he wore a white linen suit that cost more than a local family earned in a decade, his shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, a heavy gold crucifix resting against his skin. The crucifix was a lie. There was nothing holy about what was happening in this room. The mood was electric, raucous. They were celebrating a surplus. A significant amount of money that was supposed to be wired back to the operation's focal point in Miami had, through some creative bookkeeping, remained here. They were skimming. But it wasn't just theft. Theft in the underworld is common. It's a calculated risk. What was happening here was something far more dangerous. They were laughing. To understand why this laughter was a death sentence, you have to understand the map. You have to understand the psychology of distance. In 1978, the distance between Medellín and Miami felt infinite. It was 1,500 miles of deep blue ocean and international borders. To the old guard, these traditional men raised in the machismo culture of Colombia, Miami was just a satellite office. It was a colony. And the person running that colony, Griselda, was seen through a lens of profound prejudice. They didn't see a warlord. They saw a woman. To the accountant and his cohorts, she was the mad woman, a temporary glitch in a male-dominated system. They believed that geography was a shield. They believed that because they were sitting on the sovereign soil of Colombia, surrounded by their own bodyguards, drinking their own liquor, they were untouchable. They thought the ocean could stop a bullet. They thought the miles could mute the consequences. The accountant raised his glass, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. The sound cut through the haze of smoke. He leaned forward, his face flushed with alcohol and arrogance, and he said it. He didn't just refuse the shipment, he didn't just claim a delay, he looked at his lieutenants and made a joke. It was a crude, biting remark about Griselda's place in the world, a slur that suggested she belonged in a kitchen or on her knees, certainly not at the head of a boardroom table. "Let her scream in Florida," he wheezed, laughing until he coughed. "What is she going to do, swim here?" The other men roared. It was a deep, guttural sound, the sound of men who have forgotten that predators can hear you. They toasted to their own cleverness. They toasted to the mad woman and her irrelevance. But in the corner of the room, near the velvet curtains that blocked out the city lights, there was one man who didn't laugh. A young bodyguard, no older than 19, stood with his back to the wall. He was the witness. He kept his eyes on the floor, his hands clasped in front of him. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He knew the stories. He knew that Griselda didn't operate on the same frequency as these men. They played checkers. She was playing three-dimensional chess with live ammunition. He wanted to cover his ears, to separate himself from the insult, because he knew that in the economy of power, disrespect is the only debt that accumulates interest by the hour. The accountant wiped a tear of laughter from his eye, unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant. He poured another drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass. He felt like a king. He felt safe. He was wrong. The transmission of the insult was faster than the flight of a bullet. It didn't travel by magic. It traveled by wire. Within 20 minutes of the joke being told, A call was placed from a public payphone 3 blocks away from the club. The spy, a waiter who had refilled the ice bucket moments before, whispered the exact words into the receiver. The signal shot up through the precarious telephone lines of South America, bounced across the switching stations, and rang a phone in a nondescript safe house in Miami, Florida. It was 9:00 p.m. in Miami. The air was thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas. The phone was answered on the second ring. Griselda did not scream. When the message was relayed, the theft, the skimming, but most importantly, the specific gendered insult, she did not throw the phone against the wall. That is what a gangster does. She was not a gangster anymore. She was becoming a phantom. She listened in absolute silence. The silence on the line was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of a judge passing a sentence. She simply hung up. The reaction was immediate, mechanical and terrifyingly efficient. This was the moment the transition happened. This was the moment she decided that money was no longer the currency she was interested in. She wanted fear. She needed to establish a reputation so absolute that the mere thought of her name would cause men in another hemisphere to check their locks. In a garage in West Miami, the preparation began. It was clinical. There was no rage in the movements of her enforcers, only the precise application of duty. They weren't packing drugs. They weren't packing cash. 2 suitcases were brought out. They were beautiful items. Luxury leather, perhaps Louis Vuitton or high-end Samsonite. The kind of luggage that signals status. The kind of bags that the accountant himself would covet. They were stiff, pristine, with brass buckles that caught the light. The contents of those suitcases were selected with a grim purpose. The message had to be legible. It couldn't be subtle. If she simply had the accountant killed, he would be a martyr, a casualty of business. But if she dismantled his world, if she invaded his sanctuary with a nightmare, he would become a lesson. The preparation took hours. It was messy work, handled by men who had long ago traded their souls for loyalty. By 3 a.m. the bags were packed. They were heavy. The zippers were pulled shut with a finality that echoed in the quiet garage. The leather strained slightly against the contents. A private charter pilot, a man who asked no questions as long as the envelope was thick enough, was summoned to a private airstrip on the edge of the Everglades. The engines of the twin-prop Cessna whined into life, cutting through the silence of the swamp. The 2 suitcases were loaded into the cargo hold. They were unaccompanied baggage. They had no owner, only a destination. As the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, the plane banked south. It was carrying the most expensive insult in history back to its source. Back in Medellín, the sun was also rising. The accountant was asleep in his bed, hungover, perhaps dreaming of the money he had kept, the car he would buy, the power he believed he held. He woke up thirsty, his head pounding, unaware that his timeline had been severed. He went about his day, a dead man walking, checking his watch, yelling at his maids, making plans for the weekend. He assumed the silence from Miami meant confusion. He thought they were scrambling, trying to figure out where the numbers went wrong. He thought he had outsmarted the madwoman. He checked the clock on the wall. It was nearing evening again. He decided to go back to the club. Why not? It was his city. It was his room. At the airport in Medellín, the Cessna touched down with a screech of tires. The cargo door opened. The heat of the tarmac rose in shimmering waves. A courier was waiting. He was a low-level runner, a man chosen specifically because he was disposable, yet essential. He was handed the 2 heavy suitcases. He didn't know what was inside, but he felt the weight. It shifted oddly as he lifted them. He felt a cold sweat prickle the back of his neck. He had been given simple instructions. Take these to the VIP room. Do not open them. Do not leave until he sees. The courier swallowed hard. He hailed a taxi. The car wound its way through the chaotic streets of the city, up into the hills, towards the lights of the Club Campestre. The suitcases sat on the back seat, silent, ominous, radiating a dark gravity. The sun set. The music in the club started. The accountant sat at the same mahogany table, surrounded by the same sycophants, ready for another night of laughter. But the laughter was about to stop, forever. The door was about to slide open, and the message was about to be delivered. The music from the main floor of the club thumped against the walls, a rhythmic, muffled heartbeat that only emphasized the sudden stillness inside the private room. The door slid shut behind the courier, sealing the air. He stood there, chest heaving, his cheap polyester shirt dark with sweat that had nothing to do with the Medellín heat. In his hands, he gripped the handles of the two suitcases so tightly his knuckles were white. They were expensive bags, rich, dark leather that absorbed the ambient light, the kind of luggage you see rolling through first-class terminals in Paris or New York. But here, in this smoke-filled room, they looked like intruders. The accountant didn't stand up. He didn't stop drinking. He leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips, swirling the ice in his glass. He looked at the bags, then at the terrified man holding them, and finally, he looked at his lieutenants. The expression on his face was one of absolute, intoxicating victory. "Look at that," the accountant said, his voice slurred but loud enough to fill the room. "I told you, the madwoman knows how to listen. She didn't just send the money, she sent it in style." He laughed again, a dry, rasping sound. His men chuckled with him, relaxing their shoulders. To them, this was the natural order of things. The strong man in Medellín barks, and the woman in Miami obeys. They saw the luxury bags as a peace offering, a tribute to their dominance. But the witness, the young bodyguard in the corner, didn't relax. He was watching the courier's eyes. They were wide, darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for a window, a vent, anything. The courier wasn't acting like a man delivering a bonus. He was acting like a man holding a live grenade. "Put them on the table," the accountant commanded, waving a hand dismissively. The courier hesitated. A single second of defiance. "I said," the accountant's voice dropped an octave, the humor vanishing, "put them on the table." The courier stepped forward, his legs stiff. He hoisted the first bag. It hit the mahogany table with a heavy, wet thud. It didn't sound like stacks of paper. Paper lands with a soft slap. This sound was dense, solid, organic. The accountant frowned, just for a fraction of a second, but his arrogance smoothed it over. He stood up, swaying slightly, and walked to the table. He ran his hand over the fine leather of the suitcase. He was savoring the moment, dragging it out, wanting his audience to appreciate the submission of his enemy. "Open it," he said. The courier took a step back. "Patron, open it." The courier reached out with a trembling hand. He grasped the brass zipper tab. The sound of the zipper opening was the loudest thing in the world. Zzzt. It cut through the room like a serrated knife. The leather parted. The accountant leaned in, expecting to see the green glow of American dollars, the beautiful, chaotic piles of cash he felt he was owed. He didn't see green. The color left his face instantly, draining away so fast it looked like his heart had simply stopped pumping blood. He didn't scream. He didn't recoil. He just froze, his brain unable to process the data his eyes were feeding it. Inside the luxury suitcase, resting on the silk lining, were not stacks of cash. There were personal effects. A watch, a specific ring with a ruby setting, a platinum chain, and beneath them, carefully wrapped in plastic to protect the leather, were the severed hands of his top enforcers from Miami. The very men who were supposed to be his shield, the men he relied on to tax Griselda's roots, had been dismantled and shipped back to him via airmail. The room went silent. A silence so profound it felt like the air pressure had dropped. The other men at the table stood up, hands hovering near their waistbands, but no one drew a weapon. Who would they shoot? The courier. He was just the mailman. The accountant stared at the ring. He knew that ring. He had bought it for his lieutenant 3 Christmases ago. The reality of the message crashed into him. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a tax dispute. This was total surgical annihilation of his protection. "The second bag," the accountant whispered. His voice was no longer the voice of a boss. It was the voice of a ghost. The courier, tears now silently streaming down his face, unzipped the second bag. This one was lighter. Inside there was no blood. There was a single bottle of aguardiente, the cheap, fiery liquor the accountant had grown up drinking before he became rich, and taped to the bottle was a Polaroid photo. The accountant picked it up with shaking fingers. It was a photo of the very room he was sitting in, taken from the street outside, looking up at the window. It had been taken 10 minutes ago. On the back of the photo, in elegant feminine handwriting, were 3 words: "Disfruta tu trago," enjoy your drink. The implication hit the room like a shockwave. She wasn't just in Miami. She was here. She was outside. She was watching. The distance he had banked on, the 1,500 miles of ocean he thought was a shield, had evaporated. Griselda had collapsed the geography. She had proven that there was no here and there. There was only her reach. The accountant slumped back into his chair. He looked at the luxury bags, symbols of the jet-set life he wanted, and realized they were actually coffins for his ambition. He looked at his men. They were looking at him, but the respect was gone. In their eyes, he was already dead. He had insulted the Queen, and she hadn't sent a hit squad to shoot up the club. She had simply sent his own hubris back to him in a Louis Vuitton bag. He poured a glass of the cheap aguardiente. His hands shook so badly he spilled half of it on the mahogany table. He drank it. He knew that when he walked out of this club, if he even made it to the exit, his life as a boss was over. He was a walking cautionary tale. The witness, the young bodyguard in the corner, watched it all. He watched a king turn into a pauper in the span of 30 seconds. He didn't say a word. He just memorized the lesson. The courier turned and ran. He didn't wait for a tip. He didn't wait for permission. He bolted out the door, disappearing into the Medellín night, grateful just to be breathing. In the next 72 hours, the story of the suitcases didn't just spread. It became gospel. It moved through the bars, the safe houses, and the prisons. It traveled faster than any shipment of cocaine ever could. 3 other factions in Medellín, tough men who had been delaying their payments to Miami, suddenly found the motivation to settle their debts. By the following Monday, millions of dollars in overdue payments arrived in Florida. There were no missing bills. There were no negotiations. There were no jokes. The accountant was never seen at the Club Campestre again. Some say he fled to a farm in the mountains, living out his days in paranoia, jumping at every shadow. Others say his own men, disgusted by his weakness and terrified of the association, handled the problem themselves a week later. It doesn't matter, the man died the moment he looked inside that bag. Griselda had achieved what no amount of money could buy. She had purchased silence. She had proven that while you might be able to steal from her and survive, mockery was a capital offense. This event became the cornerstone of the Miami-Medellín route. It established a discipline that was almost religious. For years after, whenever a young dealer thought about skimming off the top or making a snide comment about the madwoman in Miami, an older dealer would simply place a hand on his shoulder and ask, "Do you like your luggage?" It's a brutal history, but it teaches a universal law of power dynamics. In the economy of respect, the most expensive thing you can ever buy is a cheap laugh at the wrong person's expense. What would you have done? If you were in that room and those bags arrived, would you have opened them? Or would you have run the second the music stopped? Let me know in the comments, and if you want to know what happened to the men who tried to take her throne next, make sure you're subscribed. There are more stories from the dark side of history waiting for you.